Rachel Aviv begins by turning the lens on herself. At 6 years old, she experienced what most of us would call a mental break. Though in her case it came with a surreal, almost literary twist. She stopped eating not because of some diet fad, thankfully 6-year-olds aren't that cursed yet, but because she was caught in a swirl of obsessive thinking. She was diagnosed with anorexia nervosa, hospitalized, and unlike many, she recovered quickly. But here's the kicker. Aviv never became the classic anorexia patient. She didn't identify with the illness. She didn't build her identity around it. She just moved on. This early encounter with the psychiatric system became her lifelong point of curiosity. Why do some people get absorbed into their diagnosis, letting it shape their identity, while others seem to slip out of it like a coat that never fit? And more importantly, what does it mean to be strangers to ourselves, to feel alienated from our own minds? From here, she builds the book as a collection of 4 major life stories, plus her own. Portraits of people who lived at the jagged edge of psychiatry, treatment, and identity. The first stranger, Bapu the Holy Woman. The first life Aviv opens up for us is Bapu's, an upper-class woman in India whose family watched her mind start to drift into what they saw as religious delusion. Bapu believed she had a spiritual calling and began fasting, praying, and offering blessings to those who sought her out. She was convinced she was a saint in the making. Her family, however, wasn't so convinced. They saw her as mentally ill, possibly psychotic, and sought medical help. What follows is a battle not only over her mind, but over the definition of her mind. Is she a prophet or is she sick? In the West, psychiatry often leans heavily toward biological explanations. Neurotransmitters gone rogue, chemical imbalances, a need for medication. But in Bapu's cultural context, her visions and fasting weren't just pathology. They had meaning in her social and religious framework. Aviv shows how treatment didn't just heal Bapu, it stripped her of a life that felt deeply purposeful to her. Yes, her mental health improved by medical standards, but she was left untethered, robbed of the role she felt she was born to play. Her story leaves you wondering, was she saved or was she silenced? The second stranger, Naomi the activist. Naomi's story unfolds in the United States in the late 1960s and 70s, in the thick of political activism and social upheaval. She was passionate, deeply intelligent, and dedicated to fighting for social justice. But Naomi also lived with what would later be diagnosed as schizophrenia. Her activism wasn't just a hobby, it was her heartbeat. But as her illness deepened, her energy turned toward paranoid political theories, and her life became a tragic spiral of homelessness, isolation, and mistrust of the very systems that might have helped her. Aviv paints Naomi as someone whose illness and personality were so intertwined that separating them felt impossible. To treat the illness was to risk muting her fire. To let it go untreated was to watch her disappear into its grip. Naomi's journey forces us to think about how mental illness intersects with personality and belief, and whether there's even a clean line between them. The third stranger, Hava the mother. Hava's story is about postpartum depression, but not the kind you read about in gentle parenting blogs with pastel backgrounds. This was deep, shattering despair, the kind where a mother begins to fear she's not just failing her children but might harm them. She lived in the US in a community that didn't quite know how to hold space for mental illness in mothers. Here, Aviv gets into the uncomfortable conversation about how motherhood is idealized, and how the cultural narrative leaves no room for mothers who feel lost, alienated, or resentful after childbirth. Hava's depression was treated with medication, therapy, and eventually hospitalization, but the label stuck. Even years later, she was defined by that moment in time, as if the illness was a permanent stain on her record of being a good mother. The fourth stranger, Ray the prisoner. If the other stories in the book are about the blurry edges of diagnosis and treatment, Ray's is about what happens when society decides your mental illness is a criminal problem. Ray was a black man in the US diagnosed with manic depression, now called bipolar disorder. His life was a carousel of hospitalizations, incarcerations, and brief moments of freedom. His story becomes a scathing look at the overlap between the psychiatric system and the criminal justice system, two institutions that don't often work in harmony, yet somehow manage to pass vulnerable people back and forth like unwanted luggage. Ray's fate forces the reader to confront the question, is the goal to treat people or to control them? Because in Ray's case, the system seemed more interested in containment than healing. Rachel Aviv's thread through it all. While each of these lives feels fully fleshed out, Aviv never lets us forget that she is, in some ways, part of the story. Her own early hospitalization, and the fact that she escaped without being permanently defined by it, is the quiet refrain running under the book. She wonders why she slipped out of the patient role while others became cemented in it. She doesn't offer simple answers, but she does suggest that how we see ourselves, and how others see us, shapes the course of our mental health journey just as much as any medication or diagnosis. Themes that linger like ghosts. The power of narrative, how a person understands their illness matters as much as the clinical facts. A diagnosis can be a lifeline, but it can also be a trap. Culture and context. What counts as illness in one culture might be spiritual awakening in another. The role of systems. Whether it's psychiatry, the prison system, or family networks, the institutions we rely on to help can both save and harm. Identity. Some people integrate their illness into who they are. Others reject it entirely. Neither path is straightforward. Final thoughts. Why this book stays with you. Strangers to Ourselves isn't a book about cures. It's not even really a book about illness in the traditional sense. It's a book about people. About the messy, beautiful, maddening complexity of being human when your mind feels like unfamiliar territory. Aviv writes with the sensitivity of someone who knows that a story can wound or heal depending on how it's told. She avoids the trap of turning her subjects into tragic spectacles. Instead, she lets them be whole, complicated, flawed, brilliant, and yes, sometimes lost. By the end, you're left with a strange mix of feelings. Empathy, frustration, admiration, and a quiet unease about how much of our lives is shaped by the labels we're given. And maybe, just maybe, you start to wonder about the parts of yourself you don't fully understand, the corners of your mind that might always remain a little bit foreign. Because in the end, Aviv's real message might be this: being a stranger to yourself isn't always an illness. Sometimes, it's just part of being human.